courtroom was silent, save for the soft murmur of whispers as a 17-year-old boy stepped inside. Ethan Williams gripped a worn-out briefcase in one hand, the other adjusting an oversized blazer that hung awkwardly on his slim frame. His sneakers squeaked softly against the polished wooden floor as he made his way to the defense table. Around him, skeptical glances and hushed laughter filled the air. Some whispered dismissively, while others exchanged knowing looks, their expressions laced with doubt. Sitting high on the bench was Judge Harrison, a man whose reputation for strict rulings and sharp judgments left many trembling before him. He scanned Ethan with an icy gaze, then smirked. "This isn't the gymnasium," he said dryly. "Are you sure you're not lost on your way to basketball practice?" Laughter erupted across the room, led by Daniel Whitaker, the opposing attorney, whose condescending smirk carried the weight of absolute dismissal. But Ethan did not falter. He straightened his shoulders, steadied his breath, and met the judge's gaze with unwavering determination. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "I'm here to defend my mother." The room fell silent. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The weight of Ethan's words hung heavy in the air, rippling through the gallery like a sudden gust of wind. The smirks faded, the whispers hushed. People sat a little straighter in their seats, their expressions shifting from amusement to intrigue. Ethan had not always been this bold. Just weeks ago he had sat at his kitchen table, watching his mother, his rock, his protector, crumble beneath the weight of an eviction notice she did not deserve. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes, heard the quiet resignation in her voice as she whispered, "People like us don't win." But that night something inside him ignited. If no one else would fight for them, he would. And now, standing in this courtroom, he was no longer just a teenager in an oversized blazer. He was a warrior, armed with truth, courage, and the unshakable belief that justice should not belong only to those with power, but to those who dare to demand it. The battle was just beginning. The weight of doubt and expectation pressed down on Ethan Williams as he stood before the courtroom, gripping his binder so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His oversized blazer, borrowed from a neighbor, hung awkwardly on his frame, a stark reminder that he did not belong here. At least that's what everyone in the room believed. Judge Harrison peered down at him from the bench, his expression unreadable but his reputation well known. Unforgiving, rigid, a man who did not tolerate incompetence. Beside him, Daniel Whitaker, the landlord's seasoned attorney, leaned back in his chair with a smug confidence. His smirk carried the weight of certainty that this 17-year-old boy was nothing more than a desperate, foolish child playing lawyer. The tension in the room thickened, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe, to steady his voice. He had spent too many nights poring over tenant protection laws, legal precedents, and case studies for him to back down now. He had whispered to himself in the mirror, practicing every response, preparing for every possible argument. His mother's tears were etched into his memory, the way her hands had trembled when she held the eviction notice, the way she had whispered, "People like us don't win." He had seen her work herself to exhaustion, cleaning houses, sacrificing everything for him, only to be told she would lose their home over a lie. No, he would not let them take it. Lifting his head, he met the judge's gaze with a newfound confidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves crawling up his spine, "I am here to prove that this eviction is not only unjust, but also unlawful." Whitaker let out a scoff, shaking his head. "Fascinating," he drawled. "And where, pray tell, did you earn your law degree, Mr. Williams?" The courtroom chuckled, a wave of condescension rippling through the spectators. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his binder and held up the eviction notice. "Right here, Mr. Whitaker," he countered. "I learned it by reading the same laws that are supposed to protect families like mine." Silence. He flipped to his evidence, pointing to the fraudulent notary signature that had been his breakthrough discovery. "This signature belongs to a notary who retired 2 years before this notice was issued," he stated. "Which means this document is invalid, and according to Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, an eviction based on an invalid notice is unlawful." The murmur in the room shifted, no longer amused, but intrigued. Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Whitaker's smirk faltered. Ethan could feel it, the tide turning. For the first time, they were listening. And for the first time, he was not just a boy in an oversized blazer. He was a fighter, an advocate, a son who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. The battle had begun. The weight of the courtroom settled heavily on Ethan Williams' shoulders. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Sleepless nights, endless research, and silent prayers whispered in the darkness. But standing here, facing the judge's piercing gaze and the smirking attorney beside him, the reality felt overwhelming. His fingers tightened around the worn edges of his binder, the oversized blazer draping over his slim frame like a costume borrowed for a role he wasn't meant to play. But this wasn't a game, and it certainly wasn't an act. This was his mother's life, their home, their future. Across the room, Monica Williams sat frozen in place, her hands clenched in her lap, eyes glossy with unshed tears. Ethan could still hear her voice from that night, the hopelessness in it, the fear. "People like us don't win, Ethan. They'll find a way to take everything." But he had refused to accept that. Now, as Daniel Whitaker, the landlord's attorney, cleared his throat, the smug amusement in his eyes made Ethan's stomach twist. "Mr. Williams," Whitaker said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I must say, your confidence is admirable. But let's be honest, you're a teenager standing in a courtroom, quoting laws you read online. Do you truly believe you have the expertise to challenge someone with my experience?" Laughter rippled through the gallery. A few heads shook, whispers exchanged, doubt thick in the air. Ethan exhaled, grounding himself. His hands no longer shook as he lifted the eviction notice, holding it up for all to see. "I don't need experience, Mr. Whitaker," he said, voice steady. "I need the truth, and the truth is, this document is fraudulent." The room stilled. "Your Honor," Ethan continued, turning to Judge Harrison, who watched him with a measured gaze, "this notice was signed by a notary who retired 2 years before this document was issued. That makes it invalid. According to Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, an eviction based on an invalid notice is unlawful." A murmur spread through the room. Whitaker's smirk faltered. Ethan saw it then, the shift, the moment doubt turned to belief. He had spent so long fighting to be heard, but now, finally, they were listening. His mother's words had once been filled with despair, but today he was proving something else. People like them could fight, and people like them could win. Ethan Williams stood at the defense table, his binder open in front of him, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than the oversized blazer draped over his slim frame. He could feel the eyes of Judge Harrison, the seasoned attorney Daniel Whitaker, and every spectator in the courtroom on him. They didn't believe in him. But belief was never something Ethan had relied on from others. Across the room, his mother, Monica Williams, sat still, her hands clasped tightly together, her breath held. She had spent her life cleaning homes she could never afford, sacrificing for a son she only wanted to see succeed. But today, the very home she had fought to hold onto was at stake, and Ethan refused to let her lose it. The sound of Daniel Whitaker's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Mr. Williams," he said, shaking his head, "you seem to have an impressive grasp of legal language, but let's be clear. You're not a lawyer. You have no degree, no credentials, no experience. What makes you think you can challenge me?" Soft laughter rippled through the gallery. A teenager? Challenging a seasoned attorney? The very idea seemed absurd. Ethan took a slow breath, steadying himself. He reached into his binder and pulled out the eviction notice, holding it up for all to see. "I don't need a law degree to recognize fraud," he said, his voice unwavering. The room fell silent. "This document," he continued, stepping forward, "was notarized by someone who retired 2 years before it was issued. Under Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, an eviction based on a fraudulent notice is legally void." A murmur spread through the room. Judge Harrison, who had been watching Ethan with skepticism, leaned forward. Whitaker's smirk faltered. For the first time, Ethan saw it. The shift in the air. The disbelief beginning to crack. He had come into this courtroom as a boy people dismissed. Now they were listening. Across the room, Monica Williams wiped at her eyes, pride replacing the fear she had carried for weeks. Ethan had fought for this moment, and as he stood there, undaunted, unshaken, he realized this wasn't just about his mother's home. It was about proving that justice belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford it. The weight of months of preparation rested on Ethan Williams' shoulders as he stood in the center of the courtroom, gripping his binder like a shield. His oversized blazer still didn't quite fit, but today it didn't matter. What mattered was the truth. Across from him, Daniel Whitaker, the landlord's seasoned attorney, exuded confidence. He had been dismissive from the start, smirking at the idea that a 17-year-old with no legal background could stand against him. Judge Harrison, with his sharp gaze and strict reputation, remained unreadable. The gallery murmured, their curiosity tinged with disbelief. Ethan cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, keeping his voice steady despite the nervous tremor in his chest, "this case isn't just about an eviction, it's about the law. And the law is clear." He pulled the eviction notice from his binder and held it up for the courtroom to see. "This document," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "was notarized by someone who retired 2 years before it was issued. That makes it invalid. And under Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, an invalid eviction notice renders the entire eviction process unlawful." The murmurs in the gallery shifted. Doubt turned into intrigue. Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Even Whitaker, whose smirk had seemed permanent, stiffened slightly. "Mr. Williams," Whitaker interrupted, his voice laced with condescension, "are you seriously arguing that a minor procedural error should overturn this eviction? Your mother was behind on rent. That is the only fact that matters." Ethan didn't flinch. "No, Mr. Whitaker," he responded, his tone firm. "The law doesn't see it that way. In Franklin v. Rhodes, the court ruled that a failure to follow proper procedure invalidates eviction, regardless of payment status." The shift was unmistakable now. The judge folded his hands, watching Ethan carefully. Whitaker glanced at his notes, scrambling for a counterargument. For the first time since stepping into this courtroom, Ethan wasn't just a kid in an ill-fitting blazer. He was someone to be taken seriously. He glanced at his mother, seated in the second row, her eyes filled with pride. This wasn't just about keeping their home anymore. It was about proving something bigger, that justice belonged to those who fought for it, no matter who they were. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that made even the most seasoned lawyers uneasy. But Ethan Williams, a 17-year-old with no legal experience, stood firm at the defense table, gripping his binder like it was the only thing anchoring him to the ground. His oversized blazer, a last-minute loan from a neighbor, draped awkwardly over his frame. But he didn't care. This wasn't about appearance. This was about justice. Across from him, Daniel Whitaker, the landlord's attorney, sat confidently, a practiced smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. He had mocked Ethan from the start, dismissing him as just a kid who had no business in a courtroom. Judge Harrison, known for his harsh judgments, tapped his pen against the desk, his sharp eyes locked onto Ethan. "Mr. Williams," he said, voice edged with skepticism, "this is highly irregular. Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Ethan took a breath, steadying his heartbeat. He glanced over at his mother, Monica Williams, seated in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly together, her face a mixture of fear and pride. He thought about the eviction notice, how she had found it wedged in their door, how her voice had cracked when she whispered, "People like us don't win, Ethan." He had refused to accept that. Turning back to the judge, he lifted his chin. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared." Whitaker chuckled under his breath. "By all means," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's see what YouTube law degree you earned." The courtroom laughed, but Ethan did not. Instead, he opened his binder and held up the eviction notice. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering, "this document is fraudulent." Silence. Ethan walked to the center of the room, his grip on the paper tightening. "The signature at the bottom," he continued, "belongs to a notary who retired 2 years before this notice was issued. That makes it legally invalid." He flipped to another page in his binder and held it up. "Here is the official state record proving that this notary was no longer certified at the time this notice was signed." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Whitaker sat up straighter, his smirk faltering. Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Ethan took another breath, his confidence growing. "And according to Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, any eviction based on an invalid notice is unenforceable. Furthermore, in Franklin v. Rhodes, the court ruled that procedural errors in eviction cases render them null and void regardless of payment status." The gallery shifted. People whispered to one another. Even those who had dismissed Ethan earlier now watched him with curiosity and respect. Judge Harrison sat back, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Mr. Williams," he said, "you've done your homework." For the first time, Ethan felt seen. He wasn't just a desperate kid fighting against an impossible system. He was a fighter, an advocate, someone who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. And for the first time, the courtroom believed in him too. The weight of the moment pressed down on Ethan Williams as he stood at the defense table, gripping the edges tightly to keep his hands from shaking. He was only 17, a boy in an oversized blazer, standing alone in a courtroom filled with skeptics. Judge Harrison, a man known for his unforgiving rulings, peered down at him with a look of mild amusement. Across from him, Daniel Whitaker, the landlord's seasoned attorney, exuded confidence, his smirk filled with condescension. "Mr. Williams," Whitaker drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, "it's admirable that you're here, truly. But let's not waste the court's time. Do you really think you're equipped to argue the law against someone like me?" A low chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Ethan could hear the whispers, the quiet scoffs, the unspoken assumption that this was over before it even began. But then he looked at his mother. Monica Williams sat in the second row, her hands clasped together in her lap, her eyes shining with both fear and unwavering belief in her son. He thought about the eviction notice, how she had crumpled it in her shaking hands, whispering, "They always win. Ethan, we don't stand a chance." That was why he was here. Taking a deep breath, Ethan lifted his head, straightened his shoulders, and met Whitaker's gaze without flinching. "I don't need to be a lawyer to recognize fraud," he said, his voice steady. The courtroom fell silent. Ethan reached into his binder and pulled out the eviction notice, holding it up for everyone to see. "This document," he continued, "was notarized by someone who retired 2 years before this notice was issued. That makes it invalid. And under Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, an invalid eviction notice means the entire eviction process is unlawful." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest piqued. Whitaker's smirk faded. For the first time, the doubt hanging over Ethan began to shift. He wasn't just a desperate kid in an ill-fitting suit anymore. He was someone worth listening to. And for the first time, they were listening. Ethan Williams stood tall, despite the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. His oversized blazer still didn't fit quite right, but that no longer mattered. He wasn't here to look the part, he was here to fight for justice. Across from him, Daniel Whitaker, the landlord's attorney, leaned back in his chair, his smirk unwavering. "Mr. Williams," he said smoothly, "you seem confident. But the law is complicated. You don't have the experience to understand it the way I do." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had spent too many nights buried in legal textbooks, too many hours practicing arguments in the mirror for this moment to slip away. He pulled out the eviction notice and held it up for the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and firm, "this notice is fraudulent. It was notarized by someone who retired 2 years before it was issued. Under Section 58 of the Tenant Protection Act, an invalid notice voids the entire eviction process." The courtroom stilled. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Whitaker's smirk faltered. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just a boy fighting a system designed against him. He was a force demanding to be heard, and this time, they were listening. The power of resilience and justice. Life often presents challenges that seem insurmountable, especially when faced with unfair systems, societal biases, or personal hardships. Ethan Williams' story is a powerful reminder that knowledge, perseverance, and courage can break through even the most rigid structures. He was young, inexperienced, and underestimated. Yet he proved that truth, when armed with determination, can overcome even the strongest opposition. For older generations, this story resonates deeply. Many have faced injustice, financial struggles, or moments when the world seemed unwilling to listen. But Ethan teaches us that it is never too late to stand up for what is right. Whether it's fighting for housing rights, advocating for better health care, or ensuring future generations inherit a fairer society, our voices matter. This story also speaks to the power of belief, not just in oneself, but in those who fight alongside us. Monica Williams believed her son couldn't win, yet his determination reignited her hope. Sometimes the greatest change begins with one person refusing to give up. No matter your age, your background, or the obstacles ahead, justice belongs to those who dare to demand it.